Welcome to the OnScript podcast, your home for world-class conversations on scripture and theology, where you get to meet some of the best in the field. Visit us at onscript.study. Say hello on Twitter at OnScriptPodcast and stop by our Facebook page at facebook.com/OnScript.
Hey everyone, welcome to OnScript. This is Matt Lynch coming to you from Regent College in Vancouver. Welcome also to our Biblical World listeners. This is a cross-listed episode because we're following up on our initial discussion of sacrifice in the Old Testament, myths about sacrifice and ritual in the Old Testament. And we're discussing in this episode with Kyle Keimer, who is an archaeologist and a host at the Biblical World podcast, on some of the ways that the field of archaeology can shed light on this subject. So we hope you enjoy this as a follow-up, and thanks so much for listening.
Okay, well, welcome OnScript fans. This is a crossover episode. This is like country meets rock and roll. I'm not sure which side is country and which side is rock and roll, but this is the Biblical World meets OnScript classic, like Coke. Today I have with me Matthew Lynch. Maybe you've heard his voice once or twice at the beginning of these episodes. And also Kyle, is it pronounced Keimer? Kyle Keimer?
Keimer.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I'm bad with archaeologist last names. So we did an episode on some myths of sacrifice and ritual a month or so ago, maybe longer, I don't remember, maybe 2 months ago. And Kyle listened to that episode and he thought, oh, there's all kinds of interesting material world issues going on with ritual and sacrifice that archaeologists would want us to attend to. And so he has brought a nice comprehensive list of some myths that from an archaeological perspective, we should be tuned into. So Kyle, welcome Kyle to OnScript. I think you're a first time guest.
No,
I did one with Matt and I did one. And we talked about Hezekiah and how awesome he is.
Oh, I didn't listen to that one.
Oh, you should. It's really, really, really good.
Yeah, that sounds familiar now that you say it out loud. Well, welcome either way. Welcome, Kyle and Matt Lynch. Thank you for taking the time to be here in your busy schedule.
Thank you.
So, Kyle, I guess what's the first thing you want to deal with? The first myth you want to bust up here on your 7 myths list?
Yeah, well, I listened to the episode that you guys did and thought, wow, this could be so much better.
It's funny, I thought that too after I listened to it.
No, it got the creative juices flowing. And one of the things that stuck out, I think it was one of your first points, was that Leviticus is this comprehensive manual for understanding Israelite ritual, religion, so on and so forth. And so I started thinking, well, there's this myth out there that archaeology is kind of along the same lines, that archaeology provides not only this comprehensive picture of what was going on, but it provides an unchanging picture too, from the earliest period of Israel to the latest period. And it gives us all these really crazy insights into ritualized behavior in ancient Israel that just map precisely onto the biblical text. And the reality is, archaeology can give us insights into ritualized behavior, but making the archaeology and the biblical text work together isn't a simple 1 + 1. You've got to interpret both corpora of evidence first to see if you're interpreting it properly, if you have a good framework for interpreting it, and then you see how you might bring the two together. And this is where I think bringing the archaeology in, though, with what you guys were talking about with Leviticus, actually, there's a lot of room to shed some light in a way that I don't think has been really discussed, at least in the archaeological literature.
Where would you take that, Kyle? Like, if that's the myth, then what's the counterpoint?
The counterpoint would be, we have lacunae, gaps in the archaeological record, but it can provide us insight into what the Israelites believed, what they were doing, what some of their rituals were. So there is clear room that we can articulate these things. Then the question becomes, well, how do we actually make that talk to the biblical text? And here we need to move beyond I would even say, just jump into the next myth that we're going to talk about is a kind of surface reading of sacrifice in the Bible maps onto the archaeological record. Mm-hmm. And so it'd be like, oh, I read this and I read Leviticus, and then I'm going to go excavate some site and expect to find, I don't even know what. There's an expectation you're just going to find all this material evidence from the Israelite cult in the ground. And then if you find it, you say, well, great, look, the archaeology supports or proves the Bible. And if you don't find it, you say, well, Bible got it wrong. Guess somebody was making it up from a later point in time. And the reality is far more nuanced than that.
Do you have a particular example in mind? Because what I hear you saying is that there's just a diverse landscape, both synchronically and diachronically. There's not just one set of rituals everybody is doing all the time, and it changes over time as Israelite culture. I was going to say matures, but that feels like the wrong verb.
Ages.
As it ages, yes. And some people age and mature, and some people don't. So do you have an example in mind of something that would illustrate this point?
When we look in the archaeology at different cultic contexts, and so if we start with the Bible, say, all right, well, where are places where Israel is practicing their cult? Dan is mentioned, Beersheba, Shiloh, Jerusalem, and the list will go on. And so you start excavating those sites and you say, well, what kind of material do we find there? And in most instances, particularly some of these really important sites that have so-called temples or large shrines, we don't have any archaeological evidence for those yet. Jerusalem, obviously, there's the challenge of the Temple Mount.
Mm-hmm.
Shiloh, they keep looking, but so far no specific cultic compound has been discovered there. Dan, however, is a different story. And back in the 60s through the 90s, when Avraham Baran was excavating there, they uncovered this huge cultic compound that really looks like a version of Solomon's temple. And you have this amazing repertoire of cultic material that's there. And at first, they said, well, this is going to be great. It's going to help us understand and prove the Bible that this was a cultic site for the Israelites. What they realized, and this was largely through the work of Jonathan Greer, is that the narrative that was out there about the Bible and how it portrayed the northern kingdom, i.e. that the north was this apostate, terrible kingdom because they were syncretistic and doing all these bad things. All of a sudden, when Jonathan Greer started looking at the zooarchaeological remains, right, all the remains, the bone remains of the sacrificed animals are there, he said, actually, these actually map on quite nicely to what we see in Leviticus. It looks like these northerners are actually doing, Yahwism right, according to the book of Leviticus. And so the archaeology has shed light on the biblical text, and it has caused scholars to go back and say, well, what is actually being condemned in the text, and what aspects of the ritual were problematic, if it looks like from the archaeological record that they're actually doing it right.
And by doing it right, you mean they only find animals that would be categorized as clean, or the bones of animals that are categorized as clean?
I'd have to look back through his work to see what specific animals, but it's largely sheep, goat, and cattle that you find at Dan. But it's more so the cut of meat that's being processed, and the description of what the priests are getting seems to fit with the zooarchaeological evidence. Not only with the remains that have been found around the altar, and they have this huge altar there, but then also the remains that are found in the adjoining rooms, where you have very clear kind of cultic assemblage. Again, Jonathan Greer in another publication has argued for the identification of some of these vessels with specific biblical terms that are associated with the cult. And so it's kind of across the board, everything seems to look nice with Leviticus.
And if I could ask, sorry, Matt, I want to ask one more question on this. I mean, it seems like there's a couple layers to where the Bible would come into this. One is, until you dig down in the ground, you don't know that there actually is a massive cultic center there. So that's a phenomenal alignment with what's described in the scripture, that, okay, there really was some kind of cultic center that is described throughout the Old Testament. But then the question is, well, what exactly, when you find the actual bones and the processing of the animals, well, what exactly is the problem up here? So I guess what's the next mode of investigation after that?
So the next kind of question then that comes out of that, or at least in my mind should come out of that, is what does this tell us about what they believed and what their actual rituals were? And this is where it's tricky with the nature of the archaeological record. The text can convey to us kind of meaning, specifics of what the people understood and what they thought about their activities. The archaeology gives us this physical component of it that we do have to interpret and try and interpolate perhaps the text with it to see, well, let me give another example actually to make it clear what I'm trying to get at. You look at the material from Dan, from the cultic site there, and you have not only this big altar and surrounding rooms and this large structure that probably was a shrine or temple of some sort, dates to arguably the late 10th century, early 9th century at its earliest phase, which would concord with the biblical text of when Jeroboam builds this. But along with this altar, you also find clay objects, chalices, incense stands, figurines as well. And generally, when these are found in the archaeological record, scholars will, number one, identify that context as cultic. But if you find figurines, they'll very quickly say, well, they're worshiping some other god, because we know that they don't make images of Yahweh. And we don't have any unequivocal images of Yahweh in the archaeological record. That much is clear. But are there other deities that are being represented? And the thing that's very interesting is that the actual material you find at Dan maps onto all the other cultic contexts we have in the Northern Kingdom, also to a certain degree in the Southern Kingdom as well. That is, you have incense stands, you have chalices, you have maybe figurines, you have maybe a small altar of some sorts. And while there's no uniformity to every single context, there wasn't like, oh, here's your sacrificial kit, go out and use it properly, don't ever make any changes. There is some semblance of agreement, though, across the board of what do you use in your cultic practices. And so it's interesting that at the site of Dan, you have figurines, which would seem to say, okay, this is a site, again, where they're being syncretistic, not doing it right. But then you've got the clear evidence that, no, actually, they're doing things according to Leviticus on one hand. So how do you bring the two together? And this is where a more nuanced understanding of of the archaeological record needs to come into play and ask questions about, well, what is the ritual and how do you practice specific rituals and how is that going to show up in a material way?
So one of the myths then, from that vantage point, is a myth held maybe by archaeologists too, that the picture on the ground is more syncretistic than the Bible, really. What then would you say to someone who says, like, archaeology shows us that Israel had not yet sort of fully settled on Yahweh as the main God, or certainly not the only God? The cultic ritual sacrificial contexts make that very clear, whereas the Bible presents Yahweh as like their main deity.
Yeah, that's a good question. I would caution against jumping too quickly ahead and saying that what we see in the material culture can be easily identified and kind of situated within a broader historical reading of the biblical text, such as back in the 70s, they excavated a site called Kuntilat Ajrud, and there they found these great paintings of different individuals. You have a picture of two best figurines that were interpreted as a picture of Yahweh and some female consort. Asherah is usually what was proposed. And it was tied to the fact that there's an inscription right above these two figures that says, "May you be blessed by Yahweh and his Asherah." And so they said, well, here we go. All of a sudden, archaeology is showing that those good monotheistic Israelites weren't actually monotheistic in reality, because here we have the archaeological evidence. Bad Bible. Well, read some prophets, read some of the other material, read even the Deuteronomistic history. The Israelites aren't perfect worshipers of Yahweh alone. There's lots of challenges that come with that, and they're not always just doing that. So what we actually see in the archaeology didn't disagree with what the biblical text was actually talking about for the large portion of Israel and or Israel's history. The interesting twist, however, is that we now know basically that the inscription and the drawing probably were written at different times and aren't related to one another. And this is in the final publication, they really come down on this and say they're not related. The inscription is something different, and then the drawing is added on top of it at a later point in time. And so the picture of these two best figurines, is it Yahweh? Well, there's nothing that clearly says it is. Is it Yahweh and a wife? There's nothing that clearly says it is. Is Asherah in the inscription even a reference to the goddess? Well, that's a big debate as well. It might not even be a reference to a goddess. It could be something like Yahweh's blessing and health or something like that. So we need to come back and, again, look at things perhaps in a more nuanced way, well, that many scholars just haven't done.
You keep saying nuanced, and I believe you know what that word means. But to reference Inigo Montoya, but what I'm actually hearing is to me it sounds like maybe not as much an issue of nuance and more an issue of, well, what expectations do you bring to the archaeological record, or what expectations do you bring to how you interpret the archaeological record? And whatever those expectations are, the archaeological record can find a way to meet them. Am I hearing you right?
Yeah, fair enough. I will take the point. But yes, exactly what you're saying is that we come to the archaeological record with our own baggage and we have to interpret it. And unfortunately, I think we're still left with the archaeology of ancient Israel with this approach that is very what anthropologists and kind of archaeological historians would call cultural historical. That is, we are looking for specific cultures and markers of identity, and we can break those and divide those up. And if something looks the same, it means the people are the same or the beliefs are the same. Whereas in reality, what we know is that the culture history method, number one, is it can be beneficial in certain contexts, but it's also not the most powerful for explaining behavior and symbolism and understanding. And so we need to move beyond that and say, okay, what are our preconceived notions we're bringing to the text? And can we allow the archaeology to speak on its own terms? And this is where, again, one of the big shifts that we could talk about with Israelite religion, or at least Israelite cults, is that we move from asking, is this specific vessel a cultic vessel, to what might this vessel, understood within its broader context that has a lot of cultic elements going on with it, what was it ritualizing? What was it kind of capturing? And how did the people understand what this vessel was and what it was doing? And how did that fit within their larger worldview?
Do you have a way of seeing how archaeologists can even go about answering that question? I mean, how do you look at a vessel and then understand what the people might have thought about it? Because you don't have access to, we were talking earlier about the fact that you don't have ritual manuals sitting alongside these vessels when you find them in the ground. And so at the first level, interpreting it as cultic is itself a decision that's made, not always accurately, I would assume. And then the significance attached to it is a real challenge. Is there any way into that that maybe people haven't fully explored or needs to be considered more?
Yeah, my answer to that would be yes, we can get into it. And what it requires is doing a bit of the theoretical work of looking at what anthropologists have done with religion, how they've charted it maybe ethnographically, looking at the broader world history picture as well to see, well, how are things manifest? How do people believe? And it's, again, you're never going to find a one-to-one picture with ancient Israel, but it's going to give you a framework whereby you can understand what you're seeing and potentially ask different types of questions as well. And so that would be my number one thing would be very informed theoretically with relevant anthropological theory, know kind of the archaeological approaches that have been brought to the archaeological record over the last 200 years, and also be familiar with the approaches to the biblical text. Because if you don't understand why the text is being composed and what it's trying to say and the way it's saying it, you're going to end up reading it in a way that you're trying to map onto the archaeology that is going to set you up for failure. And I think this is one of the things that many times, unfortunately, gets done. And one case study on this is the whole idea of the kind of quote unquote statehood of the united monarchy. Number one, a lot of archaeologists will question whether or not there was such a thing as a united monarchy under David and Solomon in particular. And then they'll say, okay, maybe there was, but it clearly wasn't as big as the Bible said it was, because the Bible is just all this propaganda and there's no archaeology to go with it. And you say, well, actually, the Bible is propaganda, but it's written in a very specific way that fits that context. And if you understand what it's doing and why it's doing it, you realize that the archaeological footprint isn't going to be what you expect it to be. And even in that case, as you move through the archaeology, you do see clear changes in many avenues, particularly architecture, distribution of sites, that would indicate there is a change in a political structure that goes or dates to that time period. And so do we have smoking gun evidence that says this is the united monarchy of David and Solomon? He reigned all the way from, the Brook of Egypt to the Euphrates. Well, no. But again, the text isn't really saying that either. The text is making a claim that fits in with how kings talk about things. And it actually, when you read the text well, you have better expectations of the archaeology.
Yeah.
I think it's worth pointing out too, and maybe you don't agree with this, but if you look at the world of ancient Near Eastern propaganda, like I want to give a little credit to the archaeologist who's skeptical, right? Because people do, I mean, you have all these, victory stelas where they all beat each other. They all claim victory in every battle they were in, right? Except for a few examples. And so, if you're in that world of that literature, I mean, it's a weird thing because the Hebrew Bible actually isn't from the Iron Age materially speaking, but it gets placed kind of conceptually in that world to be compared with other ancient Near Eastern texts who are materially from the Iron Age and Bronze Age. And in that world, yeah, people say lots of crazy things. There's a lot of, what they call heightened rhetoric. So you could imagine why somebody might look at the Bible and say, at least take a cursory glance at it and go like, oh, this is just this heightened rhetoric. They claim all these kind of wild things. I think what's lacking often is people going closer and saying, yeah, but they also tell you all their losses. In fact, they front their losses, not their victories, and they blame themselves for their losses and show me another nation that's doing that, right? So it's actually a more self-critical text than I think you find in the ancient Near East of any other one that I know of in the ancient Near East. And so there's that kind of superficial, there's lots of unparalleled analysis going on here. But I can understand if I'm an archaeologist that read a lot of those texts, why the Bible would, at a glance, why I wouldn't take it that seriously.
Yeah. Well, and to come back to the point you said, even now within the archaeological record, there's a growing amount of evidence and a shift to the recognition of lots of early and capable writing in the Iron Age. And so even though the final version or even a well-drafted version of the Hebrew Bible probably is late, there's actually a whole lot of archaeological evidence that indicates there was writing going on. If you think conceptually as well as how things are functioning within the society, there's actually a lot of room for that. It actually maps on quite nicely with the preceding New Kingdom in Egypt. That's kind of a carryover. And so we're even starting to rethink the possibility of when some of these longer texts could have been composed and how accurate a portrait that they are within that Iron Age context. And I would argue that I think there's a growing amount of evidence that says, no, actually, there's a lot that's probably written down in some form early on that obviously gets edited and compiled later on. But we can get a good insight into that Iron Age context.
Yeah, I didn't mean to suggest that there was no writing earlier on, but we don't have any material form of the Bible.
Right.
Like we didn't dig one up that we can date to the Iron Age, basically.
Right.
Yeah.
Yet.
Well, yeah. Although we do have that the amulet.
The Ketephenome.
The tombs. Yeah.
Kyle, if I could get back to sacrifice for a moment, what would you say to the idea that if archaeologists do adopt a more reflective understanding of the complexity of the Bible, should, when they dig up a cultic site, should they expect it to map onto the kinds of things we find in Leviticus? Or do you think that's unique to Dan? Or what sorts of correspondence should people expect to find, or rather do we find? Or is it just a messy picture and some looks like what we find in Leviticus, some doesn't, and so on?
Yeah, I think it is a messy picture, to throw that out there first. I think it's almost on a case-by-case basis of, number one, as you're digging stuff up, you identify and say, okay, I've got enough evidence that indicates this is cultic of some nature. That's going to give you kind of indication that, okay, something religious or ritual was happening here. But again, the question becomes, well, what was that ritual, or what was being ritualized, and what does it tell us about the kind of ultimate truth claims, basically, which is a component that anthropologists have identified as part of religion, is you have these ultimate kind of truth claims along with ritual and religious kind of expression or experience. And the question is, well, okay, can I identify what those are based on the archaeological material itself and then bring the biblical text in? And sometimes I think it's gonna maybe fit, but again, it has to come back to the question of, well, what is being presented in the biblical text? We don't have this end all be all manual of every single component of religious life for the Israelites in Leviticus. We have this kind of portrait of how you're going to maintain kind of identity, access to God, ritual purity, these kind of things as a community, as a nation. But what does that look like once you settle in the land and once you break out into different groups? Is it going to be, that everybody has to come to Shiloh or Mount Ebal or Jerusalem? Or do you have your individual Levites? You come to them and they have they're following some prescriptions that go along with what we read about in the text, but the actual manifestation of that might look a little bit different because, well, access to resources are different, or we don't have this or that or the other. And what you see is then kind of a fragmented picture in the archaeological record of there's maybe regional variation in how you practice the actual rituals you're doing, even though the underlying beliefs are still shared. And this is the challenge. And this is where I think more work needs to be done with the archaeology then of bridging that gap, because we can work it back the other way too and say, well, in the Bible, it talks about the Passover, which is this amazing ritual that is probably the most meaningful ritual for Israelites. There's no archaeological evidence for the Passover. I mean, how are we going to identify that unless you find a slaughtered lamb with an inscription that says this was the Passover meal? You're not going to be able to identify that.
Yeah, that's helpful, and also it gets at another point that you made earlier in our pre-recording discussion about the degree to which Leviticus law is understood to be statutory, and so did it allow for adaptation and variation, say, once they got into the land? So if these are laws that are understood for a wandering people, according to the text at least, when they're in the land, did they allow for those even up to the level of local cultic sites, which is maybe pretty controversial? And that's where maybe if we only are working from Leviticus and expecting to find that in the archaeological record, we run into problems, because if you look at Samuel's going around sort of on this circuit to other local cultic sites, and a quick reading of the Bible would say, hey, that's a direct violation of Deuteronomy 12 and one cultic site. What's going on here that he's sacrificing at multiple locations, let alone like according to the laws of Leviticus? So there's such variation in the Bible that would seem to not that it's going to align directly with what we find in archaeology, but the fact of variation is not something that should surprise us in the archaeological record.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point. And I think it ultimately comes back to, if you want to try and bring the archaeology and text together, you're going to have to identify within the biblical text kind of what those ultimate faith propositions are, and what texts give you insight into that. Well, you could arguably say, the primeval history, Genesis 1 to 11, gives you insights into what is meaningful and what has meaning for Israelites. That, okay, would we expect any component then to be brought out in the cult? And would that then leave an archaeological footprint? And there are a lot of elements of that belief and the process that go along with what they understand as kind of meaningful that just aren't going to show up in the archaeology. And so again, this is the challenge then of bringing the two together.
Do you want to talk about Arad? Because I thought that was interesting, and maybe some listeners are familiar with it. Maybe you could just talk about like what that site is, how it's been understood, and maybe the need to complicate it.
Yeah,
that's
sure.
a good specific example of a sacrificial site.
Yeah. So Arad is this in the Iron Age, so the days of the monarchy. It's this essentially fortress in southern Israel, kind of in the Negev, that has this temple there from the 9th into the 8th century. And then in the 8th century, the end of the 8th century, this temple is decommissioned. It's not destroyed. It's purposely decommissioned, and then it's built over. And so scholars have looked at this and said, well, number one, this is must be tied to the reformations of Hezekiah or Josiah that we read about in the Bible, and the centralization of the Israelite cult in Jerusalem. So that clearly something must have been going on at this site, maybe that wasn't okay, and that's why it got shut down. And then as they were excavating, lo and behold, they came across 2 incense altars and 2 matzebot, or 2 standing stones. And so they reconstructed, mind you, not in original context, but they reconstructed it as being 2 standing stones and 2 incense altars in the Holy of Holies, which implied, well, there were 2 deities there. Therefore, that's why it got shut down, because they were apparent Yahwehs. They just weren't doing it right. And this is one of the problems that we have here. The problem is that the reconstruction was not accurate. There wasn't actually 2 standing stones that were standing at the same time. There was only 1. And the incense altars were reconstructed kind of where they should go as well. And so what was basically a reconstruction by the archaeologists turned out not to actually be accurate when they went back to work more on the final publications of the site, which we're still actually waiting on at this point. But interestingly, right, so the interpretation of archaeology led to a connection to the biblical text, which was then used to either further the interpretation of the Bible or critique the biblical text. But when we correct our understanding of the archaeology, actually there's nothing that needs to be corrected in the biblical text, and some of the assumptions we come with about what the nature of Israelite cult at the site was need to be rethought. Another component that makes us rethink the nature of the cult there is that they did a residue analysis just in the last few years of the materials left on the incense stands, and they found cannabis. So these priests were in there, they were burning some weed, getting high as part of this
small
thing.
Room.
Yeah, it's a small room.
So they were getting puffy up in there.
You're gonna feel it pretty quickly, I imagine. So I've heard.
Yeah. To be fair, this is not this new weed that's, high concentration.
Yeah. Thanks for that caveat.
Yeah.
I think, and if you go to the Israel Museum today, you'll see a replica of this, and it's still like these 2 incense altars, bigger one and smaller one, in front of these 2 standing stones. And it really does convey that sense of, a syncretistic religion that, on the one hand, that shouldn't surprise us, even if that was the case, because the Bible acknowledges that sort of thing was happening. But on the other hand, I think sometimes, Kyle, you can correct me here, there's an assumption, it seems, within certain archaeological communities that the Bible presents Yahweh religion as dominant and as if it had won the day. And archaeology comes along and messes with that assumption by showing that Israel was highly syncretistic. They had a lot of local deities, household gods, and whatnot. And it just isn't at all like the biblical picture. And if anything, that idea that Yahweh had won the day, and especially as the only God, is a sort of thin, late layer on the Bible that was superimposed by elite scribes to advance their agenda.
Yeah, no, I think that is a problematic view that, again, comes down to the interpretation of the archaeology. And so there's 2 components to it. So the first one is that when we actually peel back kind of the less helpful and accurate interpretations of the archaeological record, we don't have to see this rampant syncretism in Israel, at least from an archaeological perspective, which, materially speaking, is still very debated whether or not we have even Asherah worship of any kind in the north or the south. I mean, there's no clear evidence of what that is or what it will look like. And so to say that Israel was just entirely syncretistic from an archaeological perspective is problematic. The other side of the kind of the challenge is that there are some archaeologists who will argue that, again, for the continuity of material culture basically means the continuity of a people group or of an understanding. And you could look at Arad and say the same thing. Well, they're using weed. They're using drugs of some sort as part of their religious activities. We know that the Canaanites are doing this from different cultic contexts, usually with opium, but sometimes they're burning spices as well, which have hallucinogenic components to them. And so from a continuity perspective, you say, well, the Canaanites and the Israelites are both getting high as part of their ritual. Therefore, they're the same people. Whereas nobody would argue that a rod is a holdover Canaanite shrine just because you have some continuity in one or maybe even a couple elements of the material culture.
Right.
And this, we have to break it down and say, well, even if it is the same material culture, a different people group using the same material culture can give meaning to it in a different way. And we have plenty of examples of this, not only from the Levant and the Bronze and Iron Ages, but in world history and world archaeology as well.
Yeah, I know that takes us a little bit outside this discussion, but it is a interesting one that would be good to have at some point about the sort of question of the emergence of early Israel and the continuity in material culture, why you don't have this sort of sudden influx of, I don't know, unique Egyptian wares or something in the
it's not like the Israelites. Let's assume they did show up to Israel from an Exodus and Transjordan. If they just show up and say, all right, we're landed, we're here, let's just completely throw away all the material we've ever known and use different forms so that archaeologists in the future can identify us. Yay!
Yeah,
I mean that doesn't happen. And yet,
it would have been nice though if they had.
It would have been.
Yeah, but I mean, would you expect them to bring in a bunch of stuff though, or do you think like, well, that stuff's going to break in like a couple months, and so that actually would be very little by way of trace, especially if it's a small group?
Yeah, it comes back to a sociological question, and I think this is where we have to just be very practical in the kind of questions that we ask of a process. Well, okay, what kind of lifestyle do these people live? What's the nature of the material? Would they share with their neighbors or wouldn't they? And is it, and some of these more practical questions, I think we just jump ahead of and jump right into maybe bigger questions or deeper questions without really laying the ground of that practical material that's going to really have implications for how we come to the archaeology and what we expect to find.
All right. Well, what's the next myth we need to do? That was the first one. So let's go with we're kind of hitting a few along the way, I think there.
I guess if I could just step back and just paint a bigger picture of what we're trying to move through, and again, building it back to your original discussion, you have Leviticus, which is this really detailed text, and yet at the same time, it's not comprehensive. Then you have the archaeological record, which is this great resource, but it's not comprehensive. And to bring the two together, is a challenge. But then the other component we have to remember within that is that there is time that's taking place. So, within the biblical text, you have various things being written at different times. And this comes back, Drew, to the point that you mentioned. And I got thinking on this from a podcast I think you did with Berman, I forget his first name.
Oh yeah, Joshua Berman.
Yeah, on law. And we were stuck in this idea that what we read in the text or what we see in the archaeological record is kind of, we'll call it statutory, if we will. And that is, it's written in stone, it's set, and that it's unchanging, and what you see is what you get, and it's very practical and easy to understand it by looking at it because we know what it is. And the reality is it's far more complex than that. Number one, we're not Iron Age Israelites. We're 21st century Westerners, or wherever you're listening to this from. And so we have a cultural divide, a temporal divide, perhaps even a geographic divide that we have to bridge to come back and look at things and ask things in a way that would be appropriate to that time. And so when we look at the biblical text, right, we have to remember that, but we also have to remember that there is going to be evolution along the way. And this is one thing you can see in the text. I think most biblical scholars would agree that there is changes in almost the cultic practice of Israel across the period of the monarchy. You kind of lose that in the archaeology, though. Generally, this gets flattened down and says, well, here you have a representation of Israelite cult, and that applies to the Iron Age. Well, that applies to that period, and it's more nuanced than that. You look in the early Iron Age, you have this incredible site on Mount Ebal that's this massive cultic compound, probably an altar of some sorts. It's only there for that period, and then it's never reused. Well, why? if Israel is continuing along the same trajectories with their cult or with their relations, why doesn't that continue to be used for a longer period in time? Well, there's probably any number of other reasons why that goes out of use and different locations pop up. But we have to recognize in this that there's changes in the archaeology that we see as well. And so there's the process that is probably captured in the text and the process that we see in the archaeology actually are both very similar in giving us this more detailed view, perhaps, of how variable some of these elements are.
And could we put on a continuum of, when we talk about the material culture, we're really talking about things you're digging out of the ground, brushing off. On the one end, when we say cultic, we could say things like the stone jar handles that say Kadosh on them, right? Where you can say, okay, that's probably cultic, especially if it's found in Jerusalem. On the other end, what is what's something that people find where they say this is cultic, and you're like, maybe.
Yeah, that it gets to the old adage in archaeology that anytime you find something you don't know what it is, it's cultic. Look at that crazy vessel. Oh, it's got to be cultic. I mean, it doesn't look like anything we've ever found. It's clearly.
Why would
cultic.
anybody have a miniature churn? Right?
Yeah.
Must be cultic.
Yeah, this is such a good question because it really, I think, highlights some of the challenges, particularly from the archaeological record, of identifying what is cultic.
What are examples of things that people identify as cultic, or maybe at a popular level are assumed to be cultic, but you're a little dubious of?
Oh gosh, let's see. Some things that are cultic that might be dubious of. I can't think of a good example, actually. I think it comes down to a weighting of things. One thing that people would identify perhaps as cultic are chalices and or incense stands. And in general, I would tend to agree. But again, you've got to look at what other material is discovered with those individual vessels to see, well, is it all just kind of mundane, everyday household activity, or is it something else? That can give you some clues, but it actually raises another challenge of what is kind of everyday ritual look like? And this is one of the areas that a lot of scholars are working in today is kind of what you call household religion versus maybe state religion or higher cult. And there's always been this view that, well, what was happening in Jerusalem or Dan or wherever is completely different from what the average Israelite believed. And they probably didn't know anything about any of these things from Leviticus or anything. Didn't they? Again, this brings us back to the shared kind of ultimate propositions of truth. Well, if they have these shared propositions, it doesn't necessarily mean that the expression is going to be the same in the household and in kind of the main theater, if you will. It'd be the same as saying, well, do I in my house have this nice big altar with a silver platter to hold the Eucharist, wine and bread at my house to make sure that I'm doing it exactly as it's done in the church? I do actually, but that's beside the point, right? No, right? I don't have that. And yet I could do communion, or I can practice my faith in my home in a way that maybe has a material representation that coincides or at least coheres with broader faith at a Christian level that's going to be expressed in a different way or address different matters perhaps in that more public setting.
But when they excavate a church 1,000 years from now, they just find a table and a chalice.
Right.
And so they don't know that, during COVID, people are taking Wonder Bread and, downing it with tomato juice or whatever people were doing.
Yeah, I think of, that kind of remind me of, the Magdala stone I know we don't really know what that.
It's a miniature temple, obviously.
Well, yeah. But let's run with that idea that it sort of has temple representation on it, which it seems to. One theory, this is just a theory, is that people might have used it to sort of present offerings that were then converted to money and brought to Jerusalem for actual offerings. And so now you could look at it and be like, oh, you have sort of local practices that are, conflicting with the official religion and the temple in Jerusalem. And these are not prescribed laws. So they're heterodox in some way. But on the other hand, like maybe it's an attempt to sort of live faithfully in relation to the temple system. with some recognition that there's flexibility locally and what that looks like. So I was thinking too, Kyle, of like some of the animal figurines that are found and assumed to be images of deities when they might be, but they might also be kids' toys, or they might be, I don't know what other purpose that they would have served, but
some weird collector just loved clay animals. And
yeah, exactly. It's just so some of that is interpreted and then finds its way into popular books and even academic books, as if you have this sort of major conflict between state and local sacrificial religious cultic practices in Israel. And again, like, we shouldn't be surprised if that's the case, that there was that conflict or difference. But at the same time, some of the evidence is interpreted that way without sufficient warrant at this point, at least.
yeah, and that's a good one. It brings me back to what I was trying to say with Dan and some of these other cultic sites in the north, is that at Dan, not only do you have this massive building and altar and other things, you've got the material that you typically find in all the more regional, localized, city-based cultic centers as well. It's like almost the exact same. The same kinds. You get cultic stands, you get incense altars, you get bowls of whatever kind. And so the actual assemblage that we find between the quote unquote state and the folk religion actually just looks the same in the archaeology for the most part. So again, what's the distinction? I mean, there clearly is one. Otherwise, you wouldn't have this huge temple complex. But what is the purpose of that? And again, how does that function within the kind of shared belief system?
Yeah, I think of it in, this goes back to what we were saying in the first episode on sacrifices, ritual improvisation, and that, this goes back to that Leviticus simply doesn't have enough instructions to actually perform what it's telling you to perform. And we see this in Christian and Jewish circles today, like, go synagogue by synagogue or church by church and look at the rituals, and they'll all be slightly different. And if you want to start a fight in a class of Christians, just start naming the kinds of things that can count as the Eucharist, like Dorito chip. You can always work them. Dorito chip is where most people stop, but, and then you have to say, well, why does a Dorito chip not count, right? Why is Mountain Dew not good enough for the blood of Christ? Even though there are youth groups that do that on the road, right? Because they want to do communion with. So I think this, the kind of, well, what kind of archaeological record would we expect given the diversity of ritual improvisation, is a difficult question. I think you're raising up. That's a difficult question to answer, and it has to be taken case by case. And on the issue of Dan, to switch back to that for a second, I don't know if you're hinting at this or you're just raising the question. I was running through the biblical text in my mind. The critique of Dan, the only one I can think of, is not that they're giving swine or children on the altar. It's that they're to usurp the pilgrimage to Jerusalem, right? So even if Dan is doing everything the way it's supposed to do it, and Bethel the same on the south, the problem is not that they're giving the wrong kinds of sacrifices, as Amos highlights later. It's the purpose of the altar itself.
Yeah, no, exactly. And I think that's the point that Jonathan Greer really tries to hammer home in some of his work, is that if you go back and look at the text, kind of the preconceived notion of what the North is being condemned for actually isn't what the text is saying. It is because they've drawn away from Jerusalem. It's not because they're actually syncretistic in doing, worshiping other deities. That's actually not part of the condemnation against the site.
I'm just now picking up what you were laying down back then.
Some good stuff.
Yeah. Deep cuts.
Dru, are there other myths that you want to add here as a follow-up from our previous episode?
I think the one that I thought that you included on the list here was this issue about sacrifice and how it makes us clean and unclean and puts us in these various metaphysical states before God and before each other. And I'm saying us as if we're Iron Age Israelites. I guess from an archaeological perspective, like, do you see any truth to that in these various cultic sites?
Well, again, this is where I think ultimately you're going to need the text to come in to give you the insight on that, because we don't have any inscriptions that say we're sacrificing here because we all want to be ritually pure. This is part of the impression that you could get perhaps from the text, but reading that into the archaeology is a bit problematic. And so we can only go so far with the archaeology, unfortunately, but that's where the texts come in. That's where, again, reading it in an informed way and understanding the worldview, the structure of ancient Israel is going to help you kind of read that text in a way to get at, again, those shared beliefs of what is important, what it's all about, because the archaeology just can't address some of those questions.
It seems to me, this always comes up when I take students on a tour of Israel and you hear the tour guide talk and you're like, well, maybe, okay, well, I'm not sure. That I think it seems like a truism that biblical archaeologists, if I can say, people who do archaeology and, the ancient Near East that might in some ways touch on what's going on in biblical history, they have a complicated relationship with the biblical text itself, because even someone like Israel Finkelstein, who doesn't really want to give any credit on the whole to the biblical text as like giving us the answers to what's going on the ground, it's really difficult to avoid what's going on in that text and what you find in the ground as well. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. And, there was kind of the broader history of biblical archaeology was you go out and you use the Bible to answer questions about the historicity of the Bible. And then the reaction was, no, archaeology should be its own field that asks specific kind of anthropological, sociological questions. Forget the Bible, which a lot of people still unfortunately do. But the reality was, well, that's like throwing away all, one complete corpus of material that you can use to understand what you're actually digging in the ground. Would any classicist throw away all the classical writings if they're working and doing the archaeology? Well, that would be crazy to throw away some piece of evidence that would help you to understand what was happening in the past, even if it is quote unquote propagandistic or idealized or whatever other term you want to use. It still gives us that snapshot into the perspective, at least a lot closer in time to when things might have happened than where we are. And so it does need to be factored in just carefully. One thing I just want to throw in is completely unrelated to everything we've been talking about, but it goes back to what you guys were talking about in the last episode about the ritual and everything like that, was remembering that so much of later interpretation of not only the biblical text and how it's responding to earlier times, and I'm talking later, let's say New Testament, Second Temple, Judaism, so on and so forth, and church history and modern archaeology, we need to remember that so much of everything is framed in this Hellenistic worldview, which I think both of you guys might have drawn out a bit in the last one. And that has implications that I think most people just don't realize, that a lot of what we believe today, while a lot of what's believed in the church, comes out of this early reaction or in a context of Hellenism and not an ancient Near Eastern context. And so we really need to be able to reframe our questions and our worldview to look at the material in a way that is kind of taken away from that later perspective, if you will.
And what's a manifestation of that?
Yeah, I was just going to ask for an example.
One that I would say, and you guys will probably know more, you could correct me if I'm wrong, but the idea, the whole concept or the doctrine of creation ex nihilo, right, where does this come from? Well, if you actually look, it comes from, I forget now if it's the late second century, mid second century, somewhere in there, and I forget the guy's name. He wrote an early treatise that basically was responding to the Platonic view of matter and kind of the eternality of matter, and the question of, is God separate and different from this? And it's a conversation with Hellenism that is being had that frames his new articulation that actually isn't an earlier belief, so to speak. It wasn't an ancient Near Eastern concept, but it also wasn't a question that in the ancient Near East they necessarily concerned themselves with, is who created matter. The ancient world, ancient Near Eastern world, that's not a question. It's more the question of who's in control and who has the power over everything. That's what is being addressed. And yet the questions change, though, over time, and you're addressing new questions. But if you don't remember or don't know, the earlier mindset you move into addressing things just in your context.
I wouldn't have thought of Hellenism as being a problem for archaeology. And you like to think, well, archaeology is above all this because they have data in the ground. But do you see any ways in which it affects the way archaeologists interpret the data as well, as it were?
Yeah, I think I would say that the more dominant kind of framing conceptual view for archaeologists isn't necessarily just Hellenism, but it's almost more specifically coming out of the not the Renaissance, wherever Enlightenment. There we go. You couldn't get the word out.
A stepson of Hellenism.
Yeah, and there's the idea that you can identify things and understand kind of the meaning and the reality of those things. And in particular, I think for a lot of archaeology of ancient Israel, what we could talk about is the functionalist view. And this is a term that is drawn out of anthropology. And the idea is that what you see in the ground or what you see with a people group embodies their beliefs and understandings and reality and is expressed in a material way in that time period. So it's not diachronic, it's just synchronic, but it gives you a snapshot into what they believe. And also that physical manifestation of those beliefs maps on to what we think today as well, because everything is static, basically. And the reality is that, again, functionalism is helpful in some regards, but it doesn't allow us to ask more nuanced questions about, well, what did they actually believe? How did they understand this material? Are we even asking the right questions of their text or of what this might have meant to the people using these physical materials?
Yeah. So the problem is there's an indigenous conceptuality to Iron Age Israelites, or you can pick the century you're in, even there, that might even change over time. And it just gets flattened out into, well, we've got this problem that we think, and we'll just have to translate how they think about that and how we think about that. These are basically one for one comparable.
Yeah. And to be even more explicit with it, this often shows up with the so-called early Israelite, quote unquote, state, or the early Israelite kingdom. Well, in the Bible, it says Saul, David, and Solomon kind of united the tribes, and particularly under David and Solomon, you had this grand kingdom that modern scholars have dubbed an empire, because why not? And there's, so number one, you're introducing a foreign term. There's no ancient term for empire, right? But then you come to it and you say, well, okay, I know what a powerful kingdom should be. And I also see what the text is saying. It says Solomon built all these things and controlled everything. So I come to the archaeology and I say, oh, actually, look, the sites that the text says were built have these big fortifications, stables, gates. They must be Solomon's. And this was what archaeologists did back in the 60s. And then the reaction was, well, actually, those don't date to the days of Solomon. So therefore, that the Bible is incorrect. But the question should be, what is the actual physical manifestation of this political structure? What did Solomon actually build? The text doesn't say, it just says he built these sites. Did he build a restroom there? Did he build a little, hibachi, cookout place? Did he build the gates? Did he build the walls? Did he build the bigger buildings? The text isn't explicit. The archaeologist has to provide the interpretation and make that connection. And whether you do that or you don't do that is going to impact how you view then ultimately the historicity of the claims of the biblical text. When in reality, if we go back and look at kind of the way societies operated in the ancient Near East, yeah, there might be some physical manifestation, but in the earliest stages, when a lot of these different kingdoms are growing, and that you don't find the physical representation right off the bat, because all the political structures are done interpersonally. And so, do you need to find a whole bunch of big buildings to say that David had a big kingdom that stretched from Dan to Beersheba? Well, no. The text doesn't claim it, number one. And sociologically, you don't need to even expect that, because that's just not how things were done.
That reminds me of students, when we talk about kings and kingship in the Bible, invariably students read medievalist ideas of European kings. Well, the king says so you have to, otherwise they'll just kill you, chop off your head. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, well, that's one version of a king. I'm not sure that's how kings worked in Israel. Yeah, so I think I have a clearer picture of that now. Well, Kyle, thanks for coming to this crossover episode. helping fill in some of the material details. And I feel like your other archaeology buddies are going to now hear this and they're going to be like, oh, they didn't even talk about, 1, 2, and 3. So maybe there's a third episode to come where we just really kick this dead horse all the way into the ground. I'm in it. I'm up for it. Well, thanks a lot, Kyle, for your wisdom and your insights that we truly need in order to fill out this question of ritual and sacrifice in the biblical world.
Thanks so much.
You've been listening to On Script, delectable conversations on scripture and theology. If this episode has brought you inner peace or lit your biblical fire, please consider a small donation of just $2 or $5 per month. Information on how to donate can be found at onscript.study/donate.